everyone, and welcome back to another episode of What the Forensics. My name is Journey, and I am joined here again today by the lovely Rebecca and Nicole. This week, Rebecca will be telling us all about the ins and outs of wildlife forensics, and Nicole has some information about the reptile trade and the forensic corner to end the episode for us, which I'm very excited about. I would also like to note that there is a listener's discretion advised, as there are descriptions of animal abuse, as would be expected with the term wildlife forensics. I imagine we don't go very in-depth in that, but there will be discussions of unfair treatment of animals. Mm-hmm. And with that, I will pass it over to Rebecca to tell us all about wildlife forensics.
All right. Thank you, Journey. So like I usually start discussions of science, I just want to give a brief definition. So wildlife forensics is the application of scientific analysis to support law enforcement investigate crimes that are related to wildlife, including but not limited to crimes such as trafficking, poaching, and environmental crimes. So many of the techniques that are used in wildlife forensics are actually the same that are used in human investigations. For example, we often use DNA analysis to determine what species is being trafficked, specifically the use of PCR, which you can learn about in our DNA episode. And there are also other things used such as as chemical profiling, which I don't have a specific example right now of how that's used in a human case, but it could be used for something such as identifying what kind of drug is in someone's system. And in this case, chemical profiling might be used on a piece of timber or tree to identify its species. But just because so many of the techniques used are pretty much identical to what we use in a human investigation, I'm not going to go really in depth about like the specific scientific techniques. I instead kind of want to talk about the management of wildlife crime and management of the trade, because that is equally as important as the investigation. So it's tricky to find a starting point for this conversation because wildlife crime is managed and protected by every country differently. They all have different laws. So there's no blanket statement as to what is or is not considered wildlife crime. So I think the best place for us to get started would be to discuss the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, otherwise known as, and which is what I will be calling it because that is a mouthful, CITES. So CITES is an international agreement between governments worldwide to ensure that the international trade of wildlife, both fauna and flora, so animals and plants, does not threaten the survival of the species being traded through regulations and bans of international trade in species that are under threat. So CITES is largely considered the most important piece of international legislation protecting wildlife, as there's more than 180 countries today involved in this agreement, and its legislation protects more than 38,000 species, subspecies, and populations of animals and plants worldwide. So CITES was drafted as part of a resolution in 1963 at a meeting of the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN, which I'll discuss later, which in itself was started by the United Nations. So CITES was formally enacted in 1975, and it was recognized that it would be protecting wildlife because that is beneficial to the entire planet, and everyone should be involved in the sustainability of our planet. No one country more than the other should be responsible. So at its inception, CITES was supported by 80 countries, but today, as I had mentioned, there's 184 participating countries.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm really happy that everyone's joining in. I really wish it was everyone, but maybe one day.
Yes.
So CITES itself actually only deals with international trade. So it has absolutely no say of what's going on within a country's borders with regards to wildlife activity. So CITES regulates the export and import of animal and plant goods to and from other countries. So say we were shipping something from Canada to the UK or the UK to China. but they have no say in what happens within a country. So if we were to try to ship like Atlantic haddock to Alberta, then CITES has nothing to do with that. And then it's up to obviously our own country to determine whether or not illegal trafficking is occurring inter country.
Right.
So there's also no law enforcement that works directly for CITES, which was something that kind of confused me a little bit. So CITES doesn't actually have any jurisdiction to enforce the regulations that they impose. They instead just depend on the open cooperation of the countries that are involved in CITES, and they really just depend on the national laws and national law enforcement to ensure that everyone is actually following the laws. I'm actually not.
There's no, sorry to interrupt. There's no
okay.
like actual like CITES law enforcement people.
I know. I was really confused about that too, and I didn't quite find the answer to this, but I assume it's like fines or something. But
Yeah.
if there's a country following CITES that is disobeying CITES, like what happens to them? Because there's no law enforcement. Like there's no enforcement.
Right. Yeah. That's super odd.
Yeah, I think it's sort of just similar to like how the United Nations doesn't specifically have any like jurisdiction over like governing law.
Yeah.
And then they just go through like, I guess they just depend on other countries to bring up upon like a national sort of case for it. But yeah, I just thought that was really interesting.
That is very odd.
Yeah. So going back to CITES and what they do, they basically protect species by placing them in one of three appendices, going from the most to least strict in terms of the import and export of these goods. So in Appendix 1, there are species that are threatened with extinction and or might be affected by the trade. So they might become extinct or severely threatened if we do start importing and exporting them. And this is the most heavily regulated appendix, as you can probably assume, because it involves extinction. So all commercial trade in the wild caught specimens of the species is considered illegal. And the same way, any non-commercial trade in the species still isn't easy. It requires special import and export permits, and that you have to get approved by your government. And then finally, if you are trying to maybe breed these endangered species in captivity, or you're trying to cultivate endangered plants to sell them, these are still in danger. These are still like heavily regulated, but if they are captive bred or cultivated, then they would be considered Appendix 2 specimens versus if they were in the wild when they were caught. So Appendix 2 contains species that are not necessarily threatened with extinction, but they might become threatened with it unless the trade is subjected to strict regulation. So unless we put like a really big kind of like caution sign on the export, then we could severely damage this population. So this one is largely regulated by requiring permits for exporting specimens on the list, but it doesn't require import permits, which is different to Appendix 1, where you're required to have import and export permits for each country. And then the third appendix...
I find it interesting that you need both an import and an export permit, because is there a chance that if you export something but nowhere has an import, do you just kind of like leave it?
See, I thought that was interesting too, because I think pretty much like I think you're supposed to have if say for Appendix 1 you need import export. I don't think you're allowed to even begin the export unless like imports are approved. But in the scenario where exports are approved, imports are pending, my assumption would be that they could get like, say we're talking about bear bile, which I briefly mentioned later. It's against CITES regulation for the most part. Like a lot of different bear species are quite endangered, and there's a lot of big issues with bear bile farming in Asia. But like if they were to leave Asia with a big shipment of bear bile, but Canada didn't have approval for it, I assume they would just get rerouted. back to their country, or they would be seized upon arrival and destroyed, basically.
Wild. That kind of feels like a waste. I guess if it's illegal to get anyways.
Yeah, it's like it feels like a waste of an animal's life, but at the same time, like if we do let it through, then it's gonna continue the trade. So it's like a really tough kind of conversation.
I also didn't really realize, I just put this together now because though our wildlife forensics class was so boring that I don't remember anything from it, how huge the CITES actually has to be, because if it covers like every kind of like animal trade, that's like all of the food ever kind of thing, right? Like,
yeah, it's crazy. Like we basically need to be all up to date all the time on every species that we're importing and exporting.
Yeah. It's fascinating too, like with that, the amount that already exists though, is I feel like we're always finding new species or like finding the reemergence of species too. So to try and stay on top of that, I feel like poses another difficulty or hurdle, at least for how large CITES is.
Yeah, like it has to just be a huge organization. Sorry, you say
that's okay. I was just gonna say I agree. Like I feel like the task of like identifying every animal and categorizing it would be so tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't even like comprehend how large this organization has to be.
No, I can't either. And it's this is like on topic but slightly off topic. And I also don't remember the species of fish that I'm about to discuss. So it's kind of vague. But in obviously like a lot of North American sushi restaurants, like a lot of the fish is imported because it's going to be fish that's more commonly found in Japan, where sushi's from. However, there is some sushi restaurants that people might say like, oh, I went to the sushi restaurant, I had the sashimi and I got really bad food poisoning afterwards. There's a higher likelihood than you might want to believe that you didn't actually have food poisoning, but the restaurant believed they were ordering one type of fish from an importer that is completely healthy to eat raw, and instead we're being given a very, very, very similar looking fish that is in fact very not safe to eat raw and is poisonous, which in Halifax, because as we were saying, all of us took this wildlife forensics course and we all had to take samples of foods from like wherever we wanted. So like I did fish and chips from 2 different restaurants, and then we had to profile their DNA and see if they're actually the species that you're believing they are. And someone in our class actually had this exact thing happen. She ordered sashimi from a sushi restaurant, and they believed it was one type of fish that is very common and fine in sashimi. And upon DNA profiling, they found it was actually this other fish that is very, very commonly associated with gastrointestinal issues, which people believe is food poisoning. So,
wow. I know every time I hear or I heard one of our like fellow classmates talk about this class, they were just like flabbergasted by the amount of like fish that you're consuming that's not as advertised.
Yeah, it is not what we think it is.
Food fraud, what is it called? Food fraud or something like that is really big. Another one's like red snapper is a type of fish that's really mislabeled a lot of the time.
I can honestly understand why. I don't know if I've ever seen a red snapper in person, but Ben and I were at Costco yesterday and I was convinced that they had red snapper on sale and it was actually tilapia. So I was like, oh, okay, I can see the confusion.
Yeah. That's funny.
Yeah. Anyways, I'll get back onto the appendices. So Appendix 3 is the last one, and this one is for species that are threatened locally but not globally. So in this case, it's species that might be like plentiful in other areas of the world, but in one specific country, either whether it's because of like environmental factors or human factors, has become very limited in numbers. So one member country could ask another country's assistance in controlling the trade for an Appendix 3 species. And an example of this would be that in Canada, At least according to my research, there's only one species that we actually have categorized as Appendix 3 and have requested aid for, and that would be the Otabenus rosmaris, which is commonly known as a walrus.
Interesting. Wild.
Yeah, so apparently...
Sorry, I didn't know we had walruses in Canada.
And that's why it's an Appendix 3, because we need help with its trade.
Fair enough.
It's mostly found in the northern Atlantic waters near like Nunavut and places like that, and like the Arctic Circle.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but it is commonly used by Inuit people for both food. It is apparently a very common food for them. And then also to make art with the tusks, because they use every part of the animal.
Right. Would it be illegal for them to like hunt walruses and use them for food and art because they are an Appendix 3 animal, or is it fine?
That is something that I'm not positive on, because I understand like laws surrounding the hunting and gathering of certain animals varies based on like indigenous groups.
Right.
So as you know, like a lot of, I say as you know, I'm not sure if you do, but in Atlantic Canada, lobster fishing, like the lobster industry is huge. But it is, I wouldn't say significantly easier, because I just don't know enough about it. But there is, it is at least somewhat easier for an indigenous fisherman to receive a lobster license than it would be for a commercial fisherman to receive a lobster license. And it is all because of the fact that this was their territory first. And this is the way that that historically that they got their goods and they got their food.
Right.
So I have a feeling walruses are in a similar sort of boat. But I can't say that for certain.
That makes sense.
Okay, good. So in terms of the appendices, as of 2022, I believe that was my most recent source. There's 931 species currently on Appendix 1. There's 24,429 species in Appendix 2, and only 147 in Appendix 3. And just for a couple examples to get an idea of like the wide range of what's in each one, Appendix 1 has some that we would probably very much expect, which would include sea turtles, gorillas, Asiatic, I'm not sure how to say that, lions and tigers, giant tropical pitcher plant, and sun bears. So as you can see, obviously there's animals and plants in all of these. Appendix 2 has things such as the American alligator, the American black bear, the common iguana, and the big leaf mahogany. And Appendix 3 has things such as, like I said, the walrus, the Indian gray mongoose, the striped hyena, and the black-bellied whistling duck. Obviously, there is at least hundreds more in all of those. But that's just a few examples. So which species falls into which appendix actually depends on a report that comes out every couple years by the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, or the IUCN. And the IUCN uses specialized reports on key issues, so like specific populations basically that lately we've noticed a significant decline, or just that we haven't researched heavily in a while and we want to do like a special report. And as well as the red list, which I'll discuss shortly, to determine which species are in need of additional or fewer regulations and thus being added or removed from CITES appendices. So the IUCN is primarily made up of volunteer scientists, which I love because it means they actually want to be doing this work.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I just love that a lot. The purpose of the IUCN, which I pulled straight from the website because I didn't even know how to like paraphrase this. I wanted it to be correct. So the IUCN is designed to influence, encourage, and assist societies throughout the world to conserve nature and ensure that the use of natural resources is both equitable and ecologically sustainable. So basically saying that if we're going to use any natural resources, we cannot use them into abundance so that no other nation can use them as well. But we also need to make sure that we're not using them so much that we ruin our ecosystem and they are no longer available.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of think about that as like a like the reforestation effort. So like I'm using Irving as an example. I don't really like the company Irving. That's a whole other topic. However, they cut down a shit ton of trees every year, but they also plant a shit ton of trees every year. So it's like, at least they're kind of trying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, it was during a meeting of the IUCN that CITES was born. But I'm not going to go into any more specifics about the history of IUCN or CITES because it can get really boring, and it is just the very, very like tip of the iceberg for regulatory bodies of wildlife in the world. But the most important thing to know about the IUCN is that it's a non-government organization that originated from the UN and is considered to be, quote, the global authority on the status of the natural world and the measures needed to safeguard it, unquote. So the IUCN is generally made up of 6 different commissions, all of which dedicate their research and focus on different areas of conservation. That way, obviously, so that we get like a bunch of information equally on all of them and we're not like prioritizing differently. So these 6 commissions, or like subgenres really, are species survival, environmental law, protected areas, social and economic policy, ecosystem management, and education and communication. And one of the biggest projects to come out of the IUCN was their red list of threatened species, which is very, very, very much still used today. So the red list was established in 1964, and it has become the world's most comprehensive source of information on the global conservation status of all wildlife. So this includes animal, fungi, as well as plant species. So the red list is publicly available online. If anyone's interested in checking it out, it's iucnredlist.org. It's a massive resource, not only just for people like us who are really curious about it, but also governments who are trying to determine what laws to put in place to protect species. Scientists use it to determine population levels. In general, it is just an incredibly useful and used resource. The red list has a lot of information on it beneficial to anyone that needs it. For example, it contains information about essentially every known species. And it has information such as what their habitat looks like, their geographic location, their population levels, its place in, or its taxonomy, so like its kingdom, species, all that jazz, and its red list category as well. Taxonomy isn't terribly important to the everyday person like us, but in terms of creating regulations, it is terribly important because one species of bear might be in abundance everywhere and another might be critically endangered. But this red list, as I mentioned, has different categories. And these categories are a big part of how the IUCN determines which species need to be included in CITES regulations. So there's technically 9 red list categories, some of which are more like commonly discussed by the general population than others. Like we say, oh, this is endangered, or oh, the dodo bird's extinct. But these different categories are extinct, extinct in the wild, critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, or least concern. And there is additionally 2 categories for those that were not evaluated or that there's just not enough data to determine what their category is. But I just didn't feel like those were super important to add. Yeah, essentially every single species in the world is categorized by one of these 9 categories of population level. So I apologize that this has been a lot about regulations and legislations, which I will be calling regs and legs from now on, because I will say that term again.
I like that.
But it's arguably, like, at least to my understanding of wildlife forensics, one of the most important parts of this discussion, just because without these, there wouldn't really be any forensics to be conducted, because then everything would only be happening nationally instead of internationally across waters. So humans, as we know, are the primary reason that most of these issues caused by the humans are the primary reason for most of the issues that are causing these extinctions of species. Just human activity in general. I mean, look at what we're doing to everything. And if we allow ourselves to continue the same as it's always been, we're going to cause irreparable damage, which we've already done, but we can prevent it a little more, to our ecosystem, some of which, as I said, has already been done. But I'd really love us to make an effort to not keep hurting where we live. Yep. So, as I briefly mentioned earlier, DNA analysis is one of the primary tools that we use in wildlife forensics. It is a critical tool as much in wildlife forensics as it is to any other human investigation, such as like missing persons, homicide, assault. It is very, very important. And it is a critical tool because there are many, many animal and plant products that are traded internationally that are not easily identifiable based on what is actually being imported and exported. So I know, at least when I picture wildlife trafficking, in my head, I'm picturing like whole living animals being shipped like across seas. But there is a lot of species being traded in only parts. So it might only be like a trinket, like a little figurine made of ivory, made of elephant tusk, or it might be medicine that is made of bear bile, for example. There's not a whole bear in there.
Yeah.
So as just like another quick example, pangolins are mammals that have scales, very much like an armadillo has. And for hundreds of years, it was believed by many Asian countries, but like primarily Chinese medicine, their scales have been touted as being like really, really, really medicinally helpful, as having like really beneficial properties. I didn't list examples, but I believe one of the things they say is like it lowers blood pressure, and like basically they just think it has use, but there's actually no real medical research that like has corroborated their statements about everything that it helps. But because of this, like this is like a hundreds of year old ancient medicinal tradition. Pangolins are being very excessively killed and poached pretty much solely for their scales. There are people that kill them to eat the meat of pangolins, but for the most part, the scales are like what is most sought after. And because of this mass poaching of pangolins, they are currently critically endangered and therefore on Appendix 1 of CITES, meaning that there is restrictions on both the import and the export of pangolins.
Wow. Do they like crush up the shells and then ingest them? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's actually what I was just about to get into. I was going to say that these scales, because they believe the scales are so beneficial, and they're made of, I think they're made of keratin, the same thing that like our fingernails are made of, essentially. So they're often killed and then the scales removed. However, because there's so much regulation regarding import-export of pangolins, they'll often only export the scales, or they might even crush it into like a powder or pills and add it to like some sort of supplement as like medicinal goods, and will very often not even specify that there's anything related to pangolin within these medicinal goods that they are exporting. And therefore it kind of like, you know, it flies under the radar, and then this whole trade continues.
That's sneaky.
Yeah, I hate it. Pangolins are so cute. They're so cute.
Do they regenerate their scales?
No, they don't.
No?
I don't think so.
I wasn't sure if they were like, if they were made of keratin, if they were like our hair or our nails, where they could just like regrow them.
Yeah, I don't think they are, but I could be wrong.
I'm like 99.99% sure that they don't, unfortunately. Yeah. And if they do, it's a lengthy process. But I don't believe so. I don't believe they do.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair.
Okay. In relation to like pangolin scale trading, if for say they were selling a pill or a powder, or exporting it as something just as like medicinal, but they never mentioned pangolins, researchers or scientists or border agents or whoever conducts the DNA analysis, they can take a sample of the whatever they think is suspicious. And if whatever they find in the DNA of the sample they just took falls within CITES regulations, this could very well help them catch the individuals or groups who are actively either poaching or actively breeding or involved in the export of these goods, which would inevitably like stop their operations and maybe help a few animals, hopefully.
Yes.
So another thing that is used sometimes in wildlife forensics is radiocarbon dating, because there are certain animals or products. I believe ivory is one of them. I didn't specifically go and like look into this more, but I believe learning about wildlife forensics in class, I'm pretty sure this was the case. There's certain pieces of ivory that like if it was sourced before CITES was enacted, technically speaking, it is legal to trade because it is a historical specimen. So they use radiocarbon dating in cases that they have an item that may or may not be considered a historical specimen. And then using this, obviously, we can determine the actual age of what they are testing to determine whether or not we're actually allowed to be importing and exporting. And I think this one is really cool because I don't think there's a lot of situations where it's used.
Yeah.
But it's super, super beneficial in decreasing the elephant poaching trade and like the ivory trade. Just because ivory is like even today such a hot commodity, like, which is so sad. I don't understand why, but that's beside the point. But yeah, being able to do this will help determine basically whether or not this animal was killed recently only for its ivory and therefore it is a violation, or if perhaps like this was something that came from like the 1800s and this was just normal back then because no one really cared about animals prior to the 1950s.
Yep.
So it seems like not a lot is heard in the media about wildlife crime. That's at least my personal situation. I don't know if you guys regularly see stuff about it.
No,
Okay.
never.
Yeah, which is like quite sad because it is very frequent. It's very common.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that there is absolutely efforts occurring worldwide to put an end to these trades. So, for example, I just wanted to briefly talk about Operation Thunder, which is a joint effort by the World Customs Organization and Interpol. So just in December 2023, the WCO, World Customs Organization, and Interpol actually made an announcement that detailed the success of their most recent activities played out with Operation Thunder. So Operation Thunder began in, I believe, 2017, and it's a global enforcement operation which is led by Interpol and the World Customs Organization. And it's designed to disrupt the wildlife and forestry crimes and industry. So they, with the help of various countries, because of course Interpol is like international police, but like we still need international cooperation as well. So with the aid of local law enforcement, they conduct worldwide large-scale seizures of illegal wildlife products. And as far as my research has come up with, it appears that it's about once a year since 2017 that they do like a super major seizure all over the world at once.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do they do just like one big one or like many small ones, but then one huge one as well?
I think it's a bunch of small ones over a very short period of time.
Oh, okay.
So so Operation Thunder began out of the concern that illegal wildlife trade had become one of the world's largest criminal activities, which obviously then was like largely funding organized crime groups, which for obvious reasons are really bad. And it was actually estimated, I don't know if this is like a 2024 estimate, but every single thing I've read since like 2017 says the same thing. That the illegal trade of wildlife or wild goods is worth about $20 billion American per year.
Wow.
Yeah, so it is it's a major criminal organization. And it's a bunch of criminal organizations. It's not like one massive one plotting something, but still, it is a lot of money to be laundered every year.
Yeah, exactly.
So with the most recent round of Operation Thunder, which was 2023, 133 countries were involved, which was actually, they had said, the largest country turnout, I guess you could say. It's the most countries that have ever been involved to date. And in October 23, all over the world, in like pretty much every country involved, there was a collective over 500 arrests made of individuals involved in illegal wildlife trafficking. And not only did this large amount of arrests get conducted, but in December of 2023, as a result of these arrests, law enforcement worldwide was able to conduct over 2,000 confiscations of protected animals and plants.
Wow. That's a lot.
I know. It's just crazy, like the volume of actual animal goods that travels per year. Like just a small kind of snippet of what they confiscated. Included in these seizures was over 1,370 live birds, 53 primates, 30 tons of plants, thousands of turtle eggs, 660 pounds of ivory, dozens of big cat body parts such as their pelts and like their teeth, and rhino horns as well as a pangolin, and obviously many more things seized.
That's so sad.
Wow.
I'm shocked that only one pangolin was in there.
I know. Like I was reading through the list of like things they seized, and it was notably like you see all the plurals like turtle eggs, body parts, and then it was a pangolin.
Just one.
Interesting.
Just one pangolin, which I guess is good. Like I hope that means that people aren't actively trying to traffic whole pangolins.
Yeah.
But I am curious like how many things they seized that contained pangolin scales.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't able to find that.
That's actually just crazy. I'm just kind of processing.
I know. There's actually a picture that it's within one of the sources, so we'll post the source, of course. But there's one picture that I am going to show you guys right now. This is just multiple bags, I guess. I don't know how they were trying to move these, but it says they were seized by Bolivian authorities. It's just backpacks full of turtle eggs.
Oh my gosh. What?
Wow.
Yeah, like
Those
just
are like
backpacks full.
School knapsacks.
Yeah.
Just full of eggs.
And I'm thinking because they're in backpacks, like they tried to either take them on like a commercial boat or airplane. But then I just want to know like who's dumb enough to just fill 4 bags with eggs of an illegal species and just assume that you're going to be able to get through the border. So I don't know.
Are they like thicker shells than chicken eggs, I imagine? Because would they not just break?
I don't think they're thick.
I think they're malleable a little bit, but they're not like they're not what's the right word?
Delicate, maybe?
Yeah, like the way that they would shatter, it would be different than like you can't crack turtle egg,
I think you can kind of like squeeze them a little. Like it's almost as if like an eggshell just never hardened. So it's a tiny bit squishy. But I mean they are eggs, so they obviously still need like specific care and not to be thrown into a backpack.
Well, yeah, I feel like just the ones like that are buried on the bottom are not
definitely probably not surviving.
Yeah, so it kind of feels like a wasted effort.
I know, I agree.
If it's for medicinal, like if it's being used for things like medicine and whatnot, I assume that they don't care about the quality, not the quality, but like the state that they're in, and it's more so just like the content of it. They're probably like using it, crushing it, drying it out,
fair.
like using the contents rather than keeping and preserving that egg shape.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Like if they're not actually intending to like hatch turtles out of these, then they probably don't care that they might arrive dead. Which is really sad.
Yeah.
Right?
Like it's so sad. I have not a single ounce of sympathy in my heart for people that partake in this crime. I do not. I like animals more than I like people, and really hate people that hurt them. So
Yeah.
yeah. So results are still being analyzed from this most recent Operation Thunder project or seizure, because as I said, it only happened in December of 2023. But it is estimated that at least approximately 60% of all of the cases involved in Operation Thunder were linked to international organized crime groups using high levels of document fraud in order to successfully transport these items.
Awesome.
Wow.
Yeah, so not good. I am honestly alarmed by the amount of like just the fact that they said there's high levels of document fraud, but I'm alarmed by the lack of second pairs of eyes actually looking into the boxes and saying, yep, that's what they told me it is.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so I am really glad Operation Thunder is a thing and is still very much a thing. I thought it was like a one-time occurrence when we learned about it in class. But then I looked it up to talk more about it, and I was like, oh my god, they've done like 6 seizures since we were in school. That's crazy. So yeah. Anyways, I know this episode has primarily been about legs and regs, and not so much about like science or like the specifics of how they're caught. But I honestly think that one of the most critical parts of wildlife forensics very much is the legs and regs, because without these, law enforcement might not actually have the resources to tackle international trafficking on their own. And is just as much the same. Scientists might not get the funding or may not have the support needed to be able to research these species and the population levels and their ecosystems without the aid of all of these different organizations and legislations put in place. There, like I said earlier, there's a crazy amount of different organizations actually dedicated to protecting wildlife. Just as a super quick example, like we also have what's called Traffic, otherwise known as the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network. We have WCO, like I said, the World Customs Organization. We have the ICCWC, which is the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. We got WARPRETA, which is a really fun one, which is Wild Animal and Plant Protection and Regulation of International and Interprovincial Trade Act. That one is Canada specific. Also Canada specific is SARA, or the Species at Risk Act. But as I'm just going through these, like I'm not going to say any more. But as you can already tell, there is a ridiculous amount of legislation in place to protect our wildlife, and it is still a tiny bit of a losing effort given it's a $20 billion a year industry. So of course, this means I left out a lot of stuff that I possibly could have spoken about, partially because it makes me really sad because these animals don't deserve it, and partially because we just simply don't have the time. But if you are interested in learning more about wildlife trafficking or wildlife forensics, I'd urge you to look into topics of wildlife trafficking, such as the ivory trade, the poaching of pangolins or in rhinos in Africa and Asia. The one that always gets me, and it's really sad, is the trade of bear bile and the use of bear bile farms in Asia.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah,
it's
terrible.
Horrific. They keep the bears in very tiny cages with a permanent tube coming out of their stomachs, and while the bears are alive, they drain the bear bile.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like what is it medicinal? Is that what you said?
They claim it's medicinal. Yeah.
That's stupid.
Yeah. But as you can probably hear, there's a lot of very hard to learn about topics in the world of wildlife forensics. And I honestly just think it would benefit everybody to be educated about it, because it just makes us more mindful of the products that we're consuming. I'm not saying to go vegan or vegetarian. I myself love meat. I love eating it. But you might be a little more cautious about the ingredients in, say, your makeup, or the ingredients in that soup you got from that restaurant. Yeah. So I hope you learned something from this conversation. I got a little off topic at times. But I would like to pass it off to Nicole if she would like to tell us a little bit about reptiles in their trade, because that is a whole thing in and of itself.
I would. Have you guys heard of that group in Africa, I think it is, where they've been like dyeing elephant tusks pink to prevent them from being poached? Because oftentimes, elephants will often be killed outright just for their tusks, when they can in fact be taken without killing an elephant. So there's this group in Africa that have been, I forget how they do it. It's like they put the dye in hay bales or food sources, so when the elephants go and put their tusks in, it dyes them a pink and pretty much renders it useless.
I think that's incredible. I know there's also a group that is removing tusks, but this is more so from like elephants that are on like conservations and stuff, but like they're removing tusks because even when animals are on conservations, there was a really recent case of a rhinoceros named Campbell. He was a white rhino, so incredibly endangered, living on a private reserve in Africa, and he was very, very brutally murdered by poachers.
Wow.
So like you're saying, Nicole, like there's people that are dyeing their tusks, and as long as the animal doesn't truly need it and they won't die without it, like there's also people just straight up removing the tusks and stuff just so that poachers aren't inclined to do this harm.
Yeah. So what would they do if they do like humanely, I guess, remove the tusk? Because you can't still sell it.
There are certain programs, I'm not positive which countries in Africa. This is something else we learned about. There are some programs for countries that, like, a major economy for a lot of these African countries with elephants was the ivory trade prior to CITES outright banning it. So they kind of have like a deal, not necessarily with CITES, it's with one of the big organizations. It's basically, there is a certain number of, or a certain weight of ivory that they had in the reserve when these laws were enacted, that basically say like you're allowed to sell everything within your reserve, but as soon as the reserve is dwindled, your trade is done. You're not allowed anymore. So I don't know how that would really work with those that humanely remove the tusks.
I think they like anesthetize, is that the right word? They like put them to sleep basically, and then they remove the tusk that way. Because I do believe there are some areas where they will humanely harvest these tusks, and it's because of it being their largest kind of source of income for the country or wherever. But they have like very strict guidelines as to how many they're able to harvest, the age, I think, of the elephant they're able to harvest from. Because I think there's a regenerative aspect to it. I can't be sure on that though. So they've it's kind of like the logging industry, but with ivory.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I won't go like super deep into reptiles because I feel like there's so much to talk about. We had like an hour and a half, 2 hour presentation on just reptiles. And the same could be said for so many other different species and categories of animals. But the trade of reptiles really does just happen on a large scale and kind of covertly we aren't really aware of. What we know most of are, crocodile skins, snake skins, that kind of thing. But over the span of a decade, 20.8 million live reptiles were imported into Europe alone, and Germany was actually the #1 importer, and they had just over 6 million live reptiles imported.
Wow.
Yeah, and to put things into kind of perspective with that, that's roughly 5,500 live species being traded daily over the span of a year in Europe. So
that's a big number.
That's
per
a big
day.
number.
Wow.
That's a lot of reptiles. And these numbers are just looking at one continent and only looking at live reptiles. So these aren't looking at any like reptile parts, anything made from reptiles. So it's a very lucrative business, I will say. They are exploited for a variety of reasons. We've discussed some relating to like medicinal purposes for other parts, for ornamentation, for religious objects, but also for consumption, so like eggs, meat, that kind of thing. To reduce mortality rates due to suffocation, dehydration, starvation, or otherwise, most international trafficking of live reptile actually occurs by air. And so 56% of the live reptile seizure incidents that included transport information actually involved air transport, and this is for the reason that traffickers often need to keep them alive and breathing. And I guess they've just found that to be the easiest way. It makes me think of the movie Snakes on a Plane.
I haven't seen that.
I haven't
even
either.
like the title of it.
Okay. But yeah, the fashion industry, this is a big promoter for illegal illegal reptile trading, and it adds to the possibility of extinction of many red listed species. And despite the fashion industry supporting reptile conservation, many species used for leather products are under protection of CITES. However, they're still used, still trafficked, still, XYZ.
Yep.
Thankfully, there's been a slight decline in the fashion industry using reptile leather. But in the USA, between 2012 and 2019, reported import of raw reptile skins into the USA had dropped by 88.4%, from 2.3 million to 273,000, which is really shocking. I was not expecting those numbers.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's because of like additional legislation in the States, but that is such a sharp decline in such a short period of time. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to see it just in the US too, though, because globally there hasn't really been a significant decrease, or really a decrease at all, because globally there was a decrease of 1.88%. This was between 2018 and 2019, though, so I get that it's a much shorter window, but it went from 301 million to 295 million. So we're still in the millions. We're not down to the 200,000s yet globally. And I think a portion of this, the decrease, is because a lot or many or some big name fashion brands have started to ban the use of reptile skins and animal furs. Sustainable alternatives have also been used, and I guess apple, grape, or mushroom leather has become a thing. And I recently saw something about leather being created from like mangoes, which was really cool.
Interesting.
That is super cool. I think I've also seen there's like a specific kind of cactus that one specific company's been starting to make leather out of, and it looks incredibly like real cow leather. Like, it's amazing. If we can just use plants for it, then like, why have we ever been using animals is basically what I think.
Yeah. Plants that we can reproduce and grow more of as well. Not ones that have like an incredibly long growth cycle and we can farm those to death as well.
Absolutely.
But yeah, reptiles used for research, medicinal purposes. One kind of interesting thing is that Brazil's been apparently using reptiles for medicinal purposes since the beginning of colonization and continues to be used today. And so caiman fat was used by the Amerindian tribes that von Martius encountered. I don't know, the colonizer encountered in 19th century. And it was typically applied to treat rheumatitis, which is an autoimmune and inflammatory disease that causes your immune system to attack your joints, muscles, bones, and organs. And caiman fat is still used today in rural and urban communities in Brazil for the same purposes.
And
the
so
caiman are those like really scary, small alligator-looking things, right?
I'm
pretty sure they're.
Yeah, they are. It's like it's considered an alligatorid.
Oh,
So like same family, different species. Okay.
Yeah, it's the subfamily Caimaninae, belonging within the Alligoridae family.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious, because I know you were saying like reptiles, unless I'm just reading ahead, but I know that like there's a lot of like alcohols that are made with reptiles. And I just think that's really interesting because it never really occurred to me that a lot of those could actually be like a result of illegal international trade, obviously, just because like as time evolves, not so many people locally are making snake wine.
Yeah.
But like when I was I don't know how old I was, but I was either in Mexico or Bermuda. And I remember being at like a cute little restaurant and one of the waiters brought something over for my dad to try because my dad will try anything. And it was a bottle of tequila with an entire dead snake floating in it. And like they poured a shot for him and there was like straight up like flakes of snake skin in the glass.
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
looking back now, like I'm based on where we were, I'm like, okay, I feel like maybe they actually did make this here. But like looking back, I'm like, people actually pay to have this like imported illegally. Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. So snake wine is like a really large concept and thing that people enjoy and people like to consume, as it entails in the name. It's a snake mixed with rice wine, alcoholic rice wine. And an entire snake, sometimes even alive, is just placed into a jar with this wine and then left to steep. And it's been used in traditional medicine, medicinal practices, and can even date back to about 1046 BC to about 771 BC with the Western Zhou dynasty. It's used traditionally as a medicinal liquor, and it's said to strengthen immune systems. So sometimes sometimes they'll even mix in different herbs and spices. So there are several different types of snake wine, each kind of with their own medicinal properties. And it all depends on what snake is being used, what else is added into this wine. And one is the turtle snake wine, and this is made from a king cobra and golden tortoise, along with other raw ingredients soaked in a high-quality white wine. And this is said to help kidneys while strengthening muscles and bone. There's also the three snake gecko wine, and this is popular among consumers because of its effects on the body's immune system and its ability to relieve muscle fatigue. Now, I'm not like 100% sure if there's been research to even prove the effects. The wine overall is safe to drink, and it's said to provide all of these traditional medicinal benefits. The venom from these snakes, because venomous snakes are what are typically used for these snake wines, is denatured by the ethanol that's in rice wines. Because it is alcohol, though, use it in moderation. Excessive amounts aren't medicinally beneficial at that point. So, like, I think it's more of a tonic than anything. They're taking either a shot a day or when they're feeling sick, they'll have a little bit. It is advised to avoid suspicious or unknown vendors, as there was a case that I've read about where snakes are known to hibernate, and in rare cases, snakes can remain alive even after being steeped in this wine for a few months. So there was a case I had read where a woman was actually bitten by a snake that had been preserved in wine for 3 months and managed to stay alive.
No, I don't know how that's possible. Oh my God. What?
Yeah.
That's so scary.
Check yourself before you drink your snake wine, I will say.
Or just like don't, because there are other like renewable resources that we can use to get the same sort of things as you would from snake wine. And I don't understand how like just steeping a snake in wine somehow just makes it medicinally better.
Yeah.
Well, I was wondering that too. Like they say it's like it's got medicinal benefits, but I'm just I'm and I understand like this is like a hundreds of year old kind of culture. But I just don't understand how drinking something that has a literal decomposing animal in it could be beneficial, because usually they advise not to eat things that have been dead for a while.
Yeah.
But I guess because it's an alcohol, it's slightly different, but it still doesn't really feel that different.
Yeah. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they're onto something. I really do wish there was, maybe there is more research, but like I wish there was like super extensive research specifically looking into like if it doesn't do what they say it does, is it doing anything else, like good or bad?
Yeah. Oh yeah, this is a little bit of reptiles. I could go on and on and on about it. So if people have interest and want to hear like specific case studies and specific kind of programs that are in place for these various animals that are threatened, definitely let us know, because that could be like a whole episode in and of itself.
Yeah, in terms of reptiles, we have at least at least an hour and a half of information about reptiles specifically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's me.
That's you.
Sorry. So thank you so much, Nicole, for sharing with us your information on reptiles, and you, Rebecca, educating us on wildlife forensics. It was much more interesting this time around, so I'm very thankful for that.
I'm really glad to hear that, because as I was writing, I was like, oh no, this sounds just like class. I don't want to bore you.
No, it sounded fine to me. I liked it. Yeah, wild. I hate reptiles, so I don't know how to feel about that. But I guess we'll just go on to the forensic corner, because Nicole has something she wants to share with us that I'm excited to hear about. So do you want to give us your forensic corner?
Yeah, just something small, kind of related to animals, kind of related to forensics. There's apparently scientists have discovered a fluorescent compound called a green fluorescent protein, or a GRP, that's naturally produced in a jellyfish, in a North American jellyfish called the crystal jelly, or it's scientifically named Aquaria victoria.
I like that.
I do like that as well.
I like that a lot.
I hadn't vocalized it, but it has a ring to it. But they've begun using it to actually help with fingerprint identification. So they've used this protein and turned it into a spray, essentially, using the dyes based on the GFP that can reveal fingerprints left on surfaces within 10 seconds, essentially.
Wow.
And what's really cool about it is that it's supposedly water soluble. It has low toxicity, so there's no harm to the user while using it. And it doesn't interfere with any subsequent DNA testing that may be performed on these prints.
That's so cool, because I know that's like an actual issue with like, some of the stuff used right now.
Yeah, so there was some discussion about how, one, just the chemicals that are currently used for fingerprint identification are toxic and not great for you, but also that they just compromise data. So why are we using them if it's also removing possible evidence? And researchers have also said that it can be used on fingerprints that are about a week old, which is pretty neat. So it's not like right then and there. There's some length to it. So they've created 2 colored dyes so far. There's an LFP yellow and an LFP red that they're called. And these bind to chemicals found in your sweat and oils in your skin. And in this binding, the dye molecules will kind of lock into place. And then under a blue light, they fluoresce as kind of a green. And so the different colored dyes just help depending on the surface that you're using and, the color of the surface, the whatever else of the surface. But I think this is kind of the first introduction into a forensic realm, despite GFP being widely used in biological research. Biological research, since it can be used as kind of like a harmless glow-in-the-dark tag to track cellular activity, both in petri dishes and within organisms. So the article came out a month ago, I think. So it's fairly new. We're hoping to see more of it and more of an implementation. I don't know what this poses to the sustainability of these animals and kind of that aspect, if how they're going about getting these proteins, if they can kind of create the proteins. But yeah, that was the fun little tidbit I saw today.
That's so cool. I am fascinated by the fact that it's like an actual animal, but it doesn't impact DNA testing.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Cool. My knowledge of DNA testing isn't high enough to understand or wrap my head around that. But they have done like STR testing and whatnot to see if it comes in, even like shadowing human DNA. And they said that there's been no implication so far. So
that's so cool.
Yeah.
I love that you were able to find a forensic corner for this episode that was also wildlife forensics related. Like, that's very cool.
Yeah, that is so fun. That is very topical.
Very topical. I love it.
Thank you. Google really helped me with this one, I will say.
No doubt. That's awesome. Okay, well, thank you guys so much for sharing everything that you did this episode. I loved it. Our next episode is going to be about Harold Shipman. I don't really know much based on the name, but we have some notes on our topic list saying he had like 200 plus victims and like something about lethal injection poisoning. So I'm very excited for that episode because it sounds like it's going to be a killer. So
that's good. I enjoyed that.
Thank you so much. If you want more of our terrible puns and just fun demeanors, you can find us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook at What the Forensics. Our Twitter or X is WT Forensics PC, but we don't post on there very often. Our website is whattheforensics.ca, your one-stop shop for everything forensics. Our email is whattheforensics@gmail.com if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or you just want to reach out and say hi. We like that as well. If you could, it would be awesome if you gave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. We love to read them, and they really help us stay relevant in the whole podcasting world. And with that being said, this has been another episode of What the Forensics. We hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time. Bye! Just a reminder to everyone that we are not professionals in the forensic science field. We are just interested in forensics and want to share what we are learning with our listeners. We're trying to give you the most accurate information, but we are human and can make mistakes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you next week.